say, but on the evergreen clause, they talk about a contract can only go for 3 years. But it doesn't answer the question of a one-year contract or a 2-year contract, whether that evergreen clause applies to those contracts. Because they only refer to a maximum of 3 years. Has there been any discussion in your
I
regard to those?
don't believe there's been any discussion. Most of the discussion has been about fixing this, saying that these, basically to put in statute what up to the SJC ruling had been basically the practice. If you go to the Joint Labor Management Committee, which handles a lot of these, they had an explosion of cases. I was talking to one of the people that works over there, and he said, we had like 30 cases pending. When this happened, we got in like 140 cases in a month, which was an explosion. So I think there's gonna be, I think that's something that's gonna be addressed.
The 1 and 2 year?
Well, I think probably, I don't know that it'll be addressed in terms of the 1 and 2 year. I think what's gonna be addressed is maybe putting in statute what the longstanding practice had been, which was that, hey, you can sign a contract for up to 3 years, but, if you don't have a new successor agreement in place, both parties are gonna live with what was the tenets of that agreement while the successor agreement is determined. And it's not gonna say, oh, yeah, well, this is what the contract said, now we're gonna go rechange it.
But it had to do with arbitration, correct? And that was the kicker.
I think probably it was, I think it was agreements. I'm pretty sure it was a Boston Housing Authority case, relative to firemen, and firemen not meaning what we normally think of as firemen, but I think relative to people dealing with boilers, and staffing. And I think because the contract had expired, they changed the staffing, and I think there was a grievance filed that said you can't change staffing. We have a staffing level agreed to in our contract, and finally the court said, well, it's beyond 3 years, so actually you can, because you can't go beyond that. And the practice after that was anything, would stay in place as long as the parties were trying to reach a successor agreement.
Not to belabor the point, but if the contract is only 1 year,
Right,
it seems like you can have an evergreen clause for 1 year, and then any grievances that you have can go back to the contract.
I don't know the answer to that, because the statute simply said an agreement couldn't go longer than 3 years, and by basically leaving in place the contract, I think what the court said was that was extending it beyond 3 years, which wasn't what the law stated. SJC is basically largely these days been, like, if it doesn't explicitly state, it's not in there, so. Sean?
Right, back to Quinn bill. Are there any bills that are kicking around up there that either deal with the state funding, increasing it, or giving the municipality?
I think there will be bills doing state funding, but my view is that that's gonna be something that would have to be handled in conjunction with the budget. But again, that's gonna be, it's simply a money issue. You put whatever the amount would be, my guess is it would probably be 45 or 50 million to fully fund it in the state budget, is where it comes from. So it goes in, does that mean it comes out of the $80 million increase in circuit breaker, which, depending on where you're situated in your community, might be a good thing or might not be a good thing. I think the other thing that will be up there is whether we just, you repeal the statute completely, whether you put it in as something that actually makes it explicit. It is something that can be negotiated over and put into a contract, and basically, handled, essentially putting in place what I think everybody operated under is the expectation up front. So similar to like the evergreen.
Right.
Deanna?
I guess the thing that I'm frustrated with is we keep talking about things that make complete sense to the average person about reforming or repealing statutes that are unfunded mandates and things like that. And we keep talking about, well, if we do that, we're gonna take from the circuit breaker, and we can't afford any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, as a citizen, as a parent, it's so frustrating to hear that. How do we get legislators to actually reform the things that should be reformed so that we're not doing the shell game? There is so much waste. There are so many things that need to be fixed. In your opinion, how do we fight for some of those things that can be fixed?
I think I come back to what I said before. It's the three things I said before. It's identifying a fairly focused list, because, Cliff touched on the idea that MASC, this is their top priority. So MASC has this top priority, MMA has this top priority, Suburban Coalition has this top priority, somebody else has this top priority. And all the legislators may say, well, 10 of us say, okay, I agree with MASCs, but 10 isn't enough to get it done. It's trying to have all those groups say, what is the biggest single impact of benefit that we could have and focus sort of all the resources on getting that done, whatever that particular issue is. And I think the same is true with reform, is identifying what do we think are some of the best things that we could do. And then I think it's coming back to the quality and quantity argument. So I think it's taking those three things. It's coming in with a focused list, focused target, and then trying to get as much volume, by volume, again, I mean quantity and quality, to focus on that issue. And it is somewhat tough, because you know what, we're not all similarly situated. When, as much as we can all sit here and say, generally speaking, we're fairly homogeneous, maybe within the confines of North Reading or within this room. But, I have colleagues who represent North Andover. Their district is North Andover and Lawrence. My district is North Reading and Linfield and part of Middleton. And as much as we may have healthy sports rivalries, they're a lot more similar than dissimilar. Whereas you go to a North Andover and Lawrence, and what the leadership in those two towns are talking about, or two communities are talking about, are almost exact opposites. Yes, no, no, yes. It's like, so that really presents a big challenge. And then you say, well, then you have people who are in prominent positions that represent, an urban area that's very different. I mean, the speaker's from Winthrop, and, one of his big issues is Logan noise. But that's not an issue. So it's, how you see those issues and what you deal with is really a challenge.
Right.
So.
Jeff, Jeff first?
Yes. I think you were alluding to this, and I've had this thought process for some time, but correct me if I'm wrong. In your suggestion...
The thought process, it won't be wrong.
In your suggestion to Deanna and Stan about making a priority list, were you suggesting to have them work together with the other coalitions, the other organizations, and make that list and together approach the State House? Because I've had that, thinking that that's something that should be done. There was a meeting we had with other people in the room, and I'm more or less
well, let's put it, there are certain issues. Let's flip it, because I obviously know there are maybe some labor representatives in the room. Each union or each collective bargaining unit may identify a set of issues that are important at the State House, but they may identify the first three are important to all of them, and those may be the ones that they all choose to work on and all put their weight behind. I'm saying that the same thing needs to be done. It's true of any issue. I don't care whether it's a labor management issue, whatever it is. But I think that makes sense, instead of saying, well, here's 10 issues, but the first three on Stan's list are not on the MASC's list, and on MMA's list, they're the bottom three. And because I think at the end of the day, what happens is nothing.
It's too many lists.
Well, I think it's having the leadership sit down and maybe have an internal discussion of what's important, and then have the leadership of each organization get together and say, what do we think, or how do we see this? Well, maybe this. MMA may have a different approach, because they're theoretically, bringing all the communities together from across the Commonwealth. And what's important here may not be important there, but maybe the number two issue for everybody is your number two issue. So even though you have different primary ones, everybody agrees on number two. So maybe number two should actually be the most important thing.